Hello, I'm Kate Kellogg, and with me today is John Van Maanen, the Irwin Shell Professor of Management and Professor of Organization Studies here at MIT Sloan.
Hi, Kate. Good to be here.
Great to have you here, John. John is best known for his work in ethnography, having studied people and practices in a variety of organizational environments, both public and private. His work encompasses everything from the police force to MBA students. John is beloved here at Sloan, and he's a writer on the art and science of ethnography, and that's the focus of our conversation today. John, you are known for being the one to have brought ethnography into the field of organization studies. Can you tell us a little bit about what it means to be an ethnographer?
Oh, boy. I will try. I do think of it as a very close to my own identity. I think of myself first as an ethnographer, second as a student of organizations. I think you may have said it in the introduction, in the sense the science and art, because ethnography sits somewhere between the humanities and the sciences. It's a kind of limbo, interdisciplinary project.
Well, so maybe start by, for those of us novices, talking a little bit about what you even mean by ethnography and how it relates to anthropology.
There's two sides of it, two sides of the coin. One is the study of culture, defined these days with a much smaller C than we used to use, that it's not all-encompassing, that it's fairly ambiguous, it doesn't stand still, culture moves around. It changes over time. So it's the study of this culture, of what particular people in particular places do at particular times. So it's also the study of practices. But it's more than that. It's the representation of that. Because an ethnography that was just a study wouldn't be an ethnography. It's got to be written.
So I think, what might be most interesting to an outsider is like what's required to even do an ethnography and, how it has its roots in anthropology.
It does, and it does. You're quite right. Roots in anthropology and sociology, but it was a very small cadre of people on both sides of the coin, and very few of them studied contemporary organizations. The old joke was that the sociologists got the West, and they studied urban neighborhoods, and they studied gangs, deviant activities, and the anthropologists got the rest of the world. And the more exotic, the further away they went to study, the more inaccessible the group or tribe, the more status associated with it. Well, for a variety of reasons, it's come home. Ethnography has come home. We can find the same tribal rituals in the corporate suite that we can find in the jungles. And that realization has led to what we might consider something of a golden age of ethnography. There's more of it done today than ever before. It's done in consulting firms, it's done in market research firms, it's done even in business schools, which is something of a surprise.
So when you say it's done, I know one of the things you like to tell your students is an ethnographer lives with and lives like the people they study. And why is that necessary?
Well,
what do you
I
mean
think
by
that's the engagement. It's path dependent. You go into the field not knowing much about the group you're about to study, trying to keep as open mind as possible. I always like to say ethnography can be defined as John Van Maanen getting off a plane, suitcase in hand, prepared for a long stay. But there's no guarantee that whoever it is you might be examining or learning from. And I always think learning from is a better way to talk about ethnography rather than studying, as if the people, the group is somehow a specimen to be held under a microscope. The point is living with and living like. So there's it's subtle. I mean, when you say living like, well, I know I'm going back. I'm leaving someday. So there's qualifications to be made on living with and living like. But the point is to get as close as you can to the pressures that others feel, the kinds of tasks they have to perform, such that they very soon forget that you're there as an ethnographer. And if you can't find some way to get along, some way to help, to not be intrusive, it's unlikely you'll be able to stay very long. And I would recommend a career in something other than ethnography if that's a difficult task to perform. So it's staying with, living like, and trying to understand how people go about the work they do if we're talking about organizational or occupational settings. So I've always tried to get as close as I possibly can to those situations so I can feel what it's like to be in that world.
So can you maybe give us a little specifics? I know you've done a lot of work on the police. You know, we all think of ourselves as individuals, as free agents, and you know, there's all different types of people who come into the police, and then yet when you look at people in the same job a few years later, everybody is acting in this remarkably similar way.
Well, I don't think that's unusual to the police, except the intense socialization, which is highly collective, very, very formal, takes place over a long period of time, highly designed in terms of sequences. And the only way to respond is really the way they respond, you know, historically. And if one looks back 40 or 50 years, one sees exactly the same responses, the same perceptions of the citizenry, the same notions of the world. We do have this myth that we actually are highly autonomous, highly individualized, and the organization itself, because it's something of an idealized concept, it is abstract, doesn't play a part in shaping us, and yet it does enormously.
So do you think it would be, that would hold in other settings, you know, other groups of professionals, for example?
Of course, yeah. One sees it among lawyers, one sees it among medical professions, as you've so carefully documented. One sees it everywhere you look. You know, the more intensive, the more collective the enterprise, the more one needs the support of others, the shaping goes on. One can think intellectually of designing socialization processes that are individualized, that are highly autonomous, that reward innovation and novelty, but one doesn't see a lot of that. We would like to see more of it, right? Even MIT would like to think of itself as a very individualized place, but it too has its collective constraints.
When people are joining an organization, the people they're working with become so important to them and what those people think of them.
Sure.
And you saw that in Disney too, right?
Yeah.
One of my favorite stories of yours is how the ride operators actually manage the customers.
Well, that's part of why it's fun to work there and why you're willing to work there for a short period of time, summer, maybe part-time for a year, why you're willing to work there, because it's a game. And it's a game ride operators play with customers. And as long as you're a good customer that doesn't violate a ride operator's sanctions and stays inside the line and goes over to the number to stand on that to await the car, then they'll be treated quite well. But if they're a little deviant, which happens often with young adolescent males, and makes fun of your uniform or otherwise casts disparaging remarks in your direction, you'll find yourself on that number, and when loaded onto the car, a seatbelt that's tightened up so tight that you can hardly breathe going around. My favorite trick was always, I was a submarine captain for a while, and we used to put people in the sub, and our little criminals of Disneyland we would put right under the hatch, so when the sub went under the falls, you pull the hatch, and they'd get soaked. And for the next hour and a half or 2 hours, they would have to go over to first aid and be dried out. Done with, you know, certainly the knowledge of the supervisors. and the knowledge of the foreman on the rides.
Who probably realized that this was a little bit of a release
Right,
for
it was,
all
of course, a
the
release.
workers
And they
that-
also felt that the criminal in question probably deserved it.
So it seems like Disney really, with their culture, they're just managing everything down to the littlest detail, and it's working beautifully for them. Can they export that other places?
Well, we have a wonderful example of massive exportation in Disneyland, what was called Euro Disney, opened in 1992, Disneyland Paris today. It was a disaster. They were exporting this detail down to the very last detail in France and making enormously off-the-wall comments about making Paris a side trip and alienating number of people that they really needed their support from. It was a disaster, an absolute disaster.
So can you give an example of something in the culture that you think worked very well for them in the U.S. that then didn't really translate
what
very
worked
well?
very well for them in the U.S. was both parks. I mean, they're enormous money-generating parks. When Disney, built Disney Orlando, they made some adjustments, changed things, but it's pretty much the same operation. The rule book reads in the same language. When they took it, as they first did, to Disneyland Paris, with all the advice about Paris being a central location in Europe that would draw 300 million visitors, or Paris gets 300 million visitors a year, so it was a perfect place to put Disney. The fact that Disney had been in 2 warm climates in the U.S. somehow didn't enter into their strategic design model.
Was there anything with the workers where they tried
Well,
to
the
manage
workers
them the
walked
same
off.
way?
The workers walked off. They wouldn't wear their uniforms to work. They were made fun of. The women were told they couldn't wear black hose or lipstick. There was a revolt. Disney works in the U.S. largely as part-time labor. So if it rains, everybody goes home. Well, you can't do that in France. There are labor laws that prohibit that. So they were hiring people who had to work, much to Disney's disfavor, 36 hours a week. Disney built 7 massive hotels at Euro Disney, and they couldn't fill them up. They thought people would rather live out by Disney than in Paris, and they were wrong.
Is it true that Disney has like a whole underground area where the staff are allowed to go and, sit back and relax and not act like the characters, but that the second they step out, then they have to be...
You're on stage, and in this dramaturgic notion of being off stage and on stage is very real. You actually feel it when you work there. You go from the quiet, chatter of fellow colleagues saying anything they want, to opening that gate and coming back into the park with its music and its tourism and its crowds. You really do feel it. It's like walking onto walking into the circus stand. And it's quite dramatic, actually, quite dramatic, the way the separation of the onstage, offstage. And of course, offstage is where you organize for what you do on stage. And
Do you think that's true in other settings?
yeah, I think
organizational
it. I
settings?
think it is true. I think it is true. I think this is Goffmanian, language. Irving Goffman talking about the dramaturgic nature of life. All life's a stage, and what's not staged is very hard to distinguish. Since we're all products of having learned these practices and routines and faces to put on and pull off, and what situations call for what sort of persona. I don't think that's unique to Disney. I think it's true of all organizations.
Even the front stage, backstage aspect?
Yeah, quite clearly. What can be said publicly, what has to be said at the water cooler, or what can be put in an email, what cannot. So I think these lessons that Disney is an extreme example of are applicable, as many organizations have found out. I mean, Disney runs the largest executive training program in the world.
When you came to MIT, we didn't teach that in the classroom.
No.
And now we do teach it in the classroom. Could you say a little bit about, how it fits into the other things we're teaching?
Well, you asked, one of your initial questions was, what did I bring to, or what does ethnography bring to a business school? Well, that's just it. I mean, ethnography is the science and art of studying culture. And if culture has become important, it's because it runs as a counter-narrative or a counter-discourse to the strategic view of the organization. And if you're smart enough and analytic enough and have the right resources and have done all your big data analysis, you can design an organization that will perform perfectly. And if people cannot do what they have to do, get rid of them and find somebody that can. The sort of contract version of what an organization is. Well, that's one view. It's been critiqued, of course, by the political perspective of, no, organizations are really people who have power and power over others, and they direct things. Sometimes it violates that notion of strategy. Well, that gets you so far, but it's a rather paranoid view, because what informs a political perspective, what legitimizes a political reach, well, that's the culture. Culture's about meaning, it's about interpretation, it's highly variegated, it's highly contested, it changes over time. Millennials come into the organization with different ideas, and it shifts that culture a bit.
But it's just reading your work, it seems like you're somewhat pessimistic about the ability to manage culture. And yet, in order for this to be useful to managers, they need to know in what ways they can use it. So, how can you change culture?
Well, first of all, you would change it by not saying you're going to change it. You've got to come at this indirectly. I mean, I think in some sense the culture legitimates the power structure in the organization as it exists, and the power structure chooses the design or the strategy or the next move. Strategy is future-oriented. We don't know. There's very difficult to know. There's no counter-narrative here. We don't know what would have happened under other conditions. So the culture is the base, in some sense.
When you say it legitimates the political structure, what do you mean? Just in terms of like who the ideal worker is?
Yeah. The role models, the way people go up in the organization or assume positions of power are those who have been well socialized, who know the game, who are the cultural experts, implicit or explicit, but they know the ins and outs.
So maybe it's not surprising that those people don't want to see the culture change.
They don't want to see change. They replicate. They replicate because they benefit from it.
So then how can you bring change in?
Well, there are several ways. Scandals, of course, could do it. BP is
kind of outside pressure.
Outside pressure. Internally, you can shift in sort of key positions, but I think that's rather difficult. Over time, it changes. It's a natural development. There's a whole field called organizational development that is designed to incrementally shift culture focus, practices, failures in business units. All of those can lead to change. Is it a science? No. Is it an art? Yes. The problem is we talk a lot about leadership, but it's really a kind of false
And
story.
now we talk a lot about culture too.
Yeah,
you
we
hear
talk about
people
culture,
talking about we need to manage our culture, and what do you say to your executives when they come in asking you how to manage culture?
Well, I ask specifically what the problem is and start with the business problem and then see where the link to culture may be. I think managers are too often certain that there is a kind of broad culture that covers the whole organization. We talk about organizational culture. There are 5 values that govern everything we do. a myth. I mean, there's organizations made up of many cultures at very, very different levels. There are subcultures, national cultures, language cultures, ethnic cultures, all buried inside of the organization. We all are multiple cultural people, and maybe multiple cultural disorders as well. It's which culture is relevant to what particular problem. And I think that leads to complicating managerial thinking, which I think we often need, rather than saying the 5 values that control this organization.
So sort of the idea that by identifying the problem that needs to be solved, then you'll sort of understand what are the dimensions of culture or subculture that you really need to understand in order to be able to do that and to know where the resistance is going to be to it, too, right?
Absolutely. Well said.
So how is using ethnography as a manager different from management by walking around?
Henry Mintzberg's notion of management by walking around can seem rather artificial, intrusive. And managers often are walking around with the rule book either in their head or, in fact, right in front of them to tell people how to do things. Probably the wrong way to go about it. How is it that people have figured out how to do it, usually in a way that's much better in the rule book, and have
when you say
drifted into
people, like the people on the front lines?
People on the front lines. The front lines might be engineers, it might be managers too, and often are as you move up the level. But I think the issue is really for managers thinking about how can I better manage by culture, while it's appreciating the culture and learning where help is needed and required, as opposed to telling people how the culture works. Because they know culture is a way of solving problems. It is a problem-solving device, and people faced with the same problems invent culture to solve that. Often managers forget that the culture essentially comes from the bottom. It doesn't come from the top.
So if they're walking around thinking this is a problem, if they don't understand what the culture is, they're not going to understand the reason for why people are doing it very intentionally, right?
In this fashion, right. What problems are they solving by the set of meanings and the set of practices they have invented by trial and error over long periods of time? And people who face the same problems day in and day out build pretty strong cultures.
And so do you think the manager can intervene in that? When you say the manager's job is to kind of help people,
right?
How does that relate to culture, you know?
Well, I think it is possible that one could intervene through conversation, dialogue, discourse, not by command and not by mandate, participative ways, generating discussions around how could we do it differently.
And realizing that the difference, it's not just a matter of saying let's do it differently, but there's probably all kinds of cultural values and beliefs that are sort of leading people.
Honored? Can those be honored and respected while you're asking people to take on different duties?
So you're not a big fan of we need to change the cultural values. How can we actually create change somehow within it?
How can we use those values, those respectful ways of doing things? How can we use that to accomplish
So almost
ends?
Repurposing the values to support new kinds of practices.
Right.
Sounds kind of stealthy, actually.
Well, it is stealthy. I mean, it is in some sense the notion that you go back to culture in a retrospective way to justify doing new things. That is, we're getting our culture back. We've drifted too far from what the culture was at the day of the founder, or at the day in which we were at our height. The culture's drifted. We got to bring it back, and that's honoring it.
Yeah. Well, thank you so much for coming to talk to us today. Really appreciate it.
Well, this was fun. This was great fun. Thank you, Kate.
Thanks.
Yeah, that was good. Yeah. Do you think we're done?
Yes, I think we are.
Wow. That went fast.